She led convoys through war zones, never lost a single soldier. But back at base, a female officer like her was still seen as a joke. One morning in the desert heat, a captain cracked open a Coke and poured it over her head right in front of 30 troops. He laughed. She didn't. She simply walked away. What he didn't know, she was the general's daughter. And in the army, military disrespect doesn't go unnoticed forever. What followed wasn't loud, but it was permanent. Because this wasn't just about rank. It was about dignity. Before we continue, drop a comment where in the world are you watching from. We'd love to see how far this story reaches. And don't forget to hit subscribe, because this story is just getting started. Lieutenant Natalie Pierce wasn't the kind of officer who demanded attention. She didn't need to. In the unforgiving heat of northern Iraq, at Camp Merrick, her reputation spoke for itself. At just 28, she'd already built a name for being precise, relentless, and unshakably composed under pressure. As a logistics officer with the 42nd Armored Brigade, Natalie wasn't chasing glory, she was chasing efficiency, making sure every convoy left on time, every unit was supplied, and no detail slipped through the cracks. She came from a family steeped in military tradition, though she rarely talked about it. Her father, Major General Benjamin Pierce, was one of the most respected strategic minds in the Army, but Natalie had never used his rank to her advantage. She earned her commission through grit and performance, not a last name. To most people, she was just another junior officer. To Captain Ryan Calloway, she was someone to mock a desk-bound soldier who didn't belong in the dirt. That misjudgment would cost him, because in a matter of days, the base would receive a high-level inspection, and the man leading it wouldn't just be a general. He'd be the father of the woman Calloway had just humiliated in front of 30 witnesses. The morning it happened, the sun was already punishing by 0800. The air at Camp Merrick clung heavy with diesel fumes, sweat, and dust. Lieutenant Natalie Pierce stood beside a row of MR apps, running final maintenance checks before the next convoy pushed into Sector Delta. Her mechanics moved fast, focused, and so did she, clipboard in hand, radio at her hip, hair pinned tightly beneath her patrol cap. Logistics didn't allow for distractions. Which is exactly why she didn't flinch when she heard Captain Ryan Calloway's voice echo across the motor pool. "Still playing garage manager? Pierce?" he called out, his tone smug. "You sure this isn't a little above your pay grade?" She didn't look up. She'd learned long ago that engaging him only fed the fire, but Calloway wasn't one to be ignored. He sauntered over, drawing the attention of at least 30 soldiers from both units. "I mean, really," he said, motioning to the clipboard in her hands. "This is what they train you for now. Clipboards and tire pressure." A few low chuckles rippled through the group. Natalie remained calm. "I'm here to ensure combat readiness," she said evenly, eyes still on her checklist. "You're welcome to submit any concerns through my chain of command." That should have been the end of it. But Calloway wasn't finished. With theatrical flair, he reached into a nearby cooler, pulled out a can of Coke, and shook it violently. Before anyone could stop him, he popped the tab and, with slow, deliberate motion, tipped it over Natalie's head. The hiss of carbonation was drowned by stunned silence. Sticky soda splashed across her face, her collar, soaking the front of her uniform. "There," Calloway grinned. "Figured you needed to cool off. Just trying to help." No one laughed this time. A few soldiers looked away. One or two shifted uncomfortably. Natalie didn't move. She didn't curse. She didn't speak. She didn't even blink. Instead, she calmly placed the clipboard on the hood of the MRA, keyed her radio, and redirected 2 mechanics to another task. Then she turned and walked without a single glance backward toward her office. Inside, she closed the door gently, locked it, and stood in the middle of the room as the fan overhead clacked a slow rhythm. Her skin was sticky, her fists were clenched. Her breath was shallow, controlled. Her father's voice returned like a whisper. "They'll try to provoke you. Some will hate that you're better than them. Don't give them what they want. Be better. Be quieter. Be exact." She sat down, pulled open her laptop, and stared at a blank incident report. Then, word by word, she documented everything. The time, the place, the witnesses. She didn't mention her family, didn't name drop, didn't dramatize, just the facts objective and airtight. By noon, her report sat on Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Harlan's desk. The battalion commander read every line in silence, jaw tight. "I'm sorry this happened. Lieutenant," he said, "you handled it professionally." He attached witness statements, pulled prior informal complaints about Calloway from personnel records, and pushed the packet forward to Calloway's battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Reese. That's where things stalled. Reese skimmed the report, scoffed, and set it aside. His connection to Calloway's father, a retired colonel with deep roots, was no secret. "I'll handle it personally," he told Harlan. "It was just a joke. Let's not blow this out of proportion." Natalie was notified that no formal investigation would be launched. Reese intended to counsel Calloway privately. That should have been the end of it. But Natalie knew something Calloway and Reese didn't. Major General Benjamin Pierce, her father, was due to arrive at Camp Merrick in less than 48 hours for a full-scale logistics assessment of the region. His visit wasn't publicized. His itinerary wasn't shared. But Natalie knew. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't threaten, didn't hint. She went back to work, tightening procedures, reinforcing supply protocols, overseeing convoy prep as if nothing had happened. But her soldiers noticed something shift. The ones who had witnessed the coke incident stood straighter around her. They worked faster. They trusted her more not out of fear, but out of respect for how she'd handled herself. She had proven something not just to them, but to herself. That control wasn't about silence, it was about strategy. That rank meant nothing without integrity, and that the right moment always came if you were patient enough to wait for it. 2 days later, Camp Merrick woke up to a flurry of movement that no one had expected. A Black Hawk touched down just after sunrise, kicking up clouds of red dust as a 4-person advance team stepped out, clipped radios, dark sunglasses, sharp movements. By 0900 hours, word had spread a general was on base for an unannounced inspection. Not just any general, Major General Benjamin Pierce, commander of regional logistics operations across the entire sector. For most officers, that name brought pressure. For Captain Ryan Calloway, it meant nothing. He barely registered the news, too busy complaining about vehicle allocation in the talk and checking himself in the mirror between briefings. The irony. He still didn't know Natalie's last name beyond Lieutenant Pierce. He'd never cared to remember it. But Natalie knew. She'd known since the moment she typed up the incident report that her father's arrival could change everything, but only if it happened naturally. No favors, no interference. She wasn't looking for vengeance. She was waiting for the truth to reveal itself on its own timeline. And it did. On the general's second day at Camp Merrick, he requested a walkthrough of the logistics wing, specifically the motor pool. He wanted to see maintenance operations firsthand, meet with junior officers, and assess how supply coordination was flowing in real time. Lieutenant Colonel Harlan escorted him. Natalie, meanwhile, was in the middle of coordinating a late shipment of fuel filters when her radio crackled. "Lieutenant Pierce, report to Briefing Room C. General's requesting an operational overview." She paused, heart steady. "Copy." She arrived 5 minutes later, uniform crisp, hair tight, clipboard in hand. When she stepped into the room, the general was already standing at the front, arms folded, reading from a printed manifest. He didn't smile, he didn't blink. She stood at attention and delivered a flawless report: convoy timelines, projected wear on MR app suspensions, estimated shortages. Not once did he acknowledge her as anything other than Lieutenant Pierce. To anyone watching, it was textbook professionalism, but beneath the surface, a current was building. After the briefing ended, Natalie saluted, received a nod of dismissal, and exited without hesitation. General Pierce waited until the room was empty before turning to Colonel Harlan. "I've reviewed a number of incident reports this week," he said. One in particular stood out. Harlan gave a single nod. The Coke incident. You investigated. I filed it immediately. Witness statements, prior behavior reports. It was shut down at battalion level. No formal action. Who shut it down? Lieutenant Colonel Reese. The general's jaw tensed. Call Reese and Captain Calloway. I want them in this room in 30 minutes. When they arrived, both men appeared casual. Reese leaned back slightly in his chair, confident. Calloway walked in smirking, assuming this was another status meeting. He still hadn't put the pieces together. General Pierce sat at the head of the table. He didn't raise his voice, didn't posture. Captain Calloway, he said, I'd like to hear your account of the motor pool incident involving Lieutenant Natalie Pierce. Calloway raised an eyebrow. The Coke thing. He laughed lightly. Just a joke, sir. No harm meant. I apologized. She was a little stiff. Figured she needed to loosen up. No one really made a big deal out of it. The general's face remained unreadable. She didn't overreact. No, sir. She was just quiet. Honestly, I think she took it too seriously. General Pierce leaned forward slightly. She's my daughter. The silence hit like a grenade. Calloway froze. The blood drained from his face so fast it was visible. Reese's shoulders shifted slightly, finally realizing what room they were in and how badly they'd miscalculated. The general continued, his voice still calm. But this is not about who she is to me. This is about who you are as an officer. You humiliated a junior officer in front of soldiers under both your commands. You created a hostile environment. You disrespected the rank, the uniform, and the principles this army is built on. He turned to Reese. You ignored formal complaints. You bypassed army protocol to protect someone based on personal relationships. That is a failure in leadership. Reese started to speak, but General Pierce cut him off. I've ordered a command-directed investigation. Effective immediately. Captain Calloway is relieved of duty pending the outcome. His access is restricted, and he will not return to his unit until further notice. Then, turning back to Calloway. Dismissed. Calloway rose shakily, saluted, and exited without a word. Outside, the weight of what had just happened settled across the base like a storm front. Officers whispered. Enlisted soldiers stared. Natalie said nothing. She didn't have to. 3 days later, the investigation confirmed a pattern of misconduct. Captain Ryan Calloway received a general officer memorandum of reprimand permanent, career ending. He was reassigned to a rear echelon administrative post and quietly disappeared from the field. But the story didn't. It traveled not because Natalie had told it, but because others had witnessed it. They saw what professionalism looked like under pressure. They saw restraint where there could have been retaliation, and they saw what happened when the system, for once, held the right people accountable. After Captain Calloway's reassignment, the air at Camp Merrick shifted. No one spoke openly about what happened. That wasn't how things worked. But word travels fast in tight units and even faster in ones under pressure. The story made its way through the barracks, across the chow hall, and into the motor pool where it had all started. And slowly, the way people looked at Lieutenant Natalie Pierce began to change. Not because they suddenly learned who her father was, but because of how she had carried herself before they ever knew. Natalie never once used the incident to elevate herself. She never brought it up, never changed how she led, never acted like she had something over anyone. She kept her tone steady during briefings, stayed hands-on during maintenance inspections, and refused to let the attention shift away from the mission. But her soldiers noticed the difference in how others treated her. The ones who had seen her get soaked in front of their entire section now looked at her with a different kind of respect. It wasn't just rank anymore. It was earned authority, real leadership. They'd seen her absorb humiliation and respond with discipline. They'd seen her choose professionalism over pride. One sergeant who'd served 3 tours leaned into a younger specialist and said quietly, "That right there, that's a real officer. That's who you follow when things get ugly." Even soldiers from outside her unit started paying closer attention. She got more requests for logistics support, more radio calls for route guidance. Other lieutenants who once saw her as the quiet one in supply now sought her input during planning sessions. Her opinions started to carry weight beyond her MOS. And yet, Natalie didn't change a thing. She still showed up early, still stayed late, still reviewed convoy manifests twice, still checked tire pressure herself when she didn't trust the numbers. Because for her, the lesson had never been about vengeance. It had always been about the standard. And while others watched, unsure of how she'd handle the attention, Natalie remained focused on the work. Her father had once told her that real leadership wasn't about being loud. It was about consistency in the face of disrespect and clarity when the pressure mounted. The only time the general spoke to her directly about what happened came 3 nights after the investigation concluded. She was reviewing supply metrics in her office when the door opened and he stepped inside. He closed it behind him and stood silently for a moment, eyes scanning the whiteboard filled with color-coded status updates. "You've kept busy," he said. She nodded. "Convoy's got a timing gap, trying to close it by reallocating fuel trucks." He crossed his arms, glanced at the notes. "I read your report," he said after a pause. "It was precise." "I didn't think it needed emotion," she replied. He gave a small, tired smile. "No, it didn't. You did it exactly right." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken pride hanging in the room like the dry desert air. Then he added, more quietly, "I've spent my career telling people to lead with discipline, to hold the line. I don't think I ever really knew what that looked like until this week." Natalie didn't respond. She didn't need to. They both knew what had been proven not just about Calloway, but about her. The next morning, Natalie received word she was being recommended for early promotion to captain, not because of who her father was, but because her performance spoke louder than bloodlines ever could. The recommendation came from Lieutenant Colonel Harlan and was co-signed by the Regional Logistics Command. It highlighted her ability to maintain composure under public provocation, to lead without retaliation, and to reinforce standards through quiet resilience. But Natalie barely looked at the packet. She filed it away and returned to her checklist. Her convoy was still short a radio operator, and the roads into Sector Delta weren't getting any safer. Later that week, as the general's helicopter lifted off from Camp Merrick, she stood on the edge of the LZ and saluted with the rest of the formation. He didn't break protocol, didn't look her way. But in the small nod he gave as he stepped aboard, she understood everything he couldn't say in uniform. She had earned it. Not just his pride, but the kind of respect no rank can buy. 3 weeks after the incident, a message arrived from Regional Command. It wasn't marked urgent, but the subject line carried weight: temporary assignment request, Task Force Kilo. Lieutenant Natalie Pierce read it twice. Task Force Kilo wasn't just another logistics outfit. It was a multi-branch rapid deployment unit focused on supporting high-risk operations across contested zones. Their convoys didn't follow paved roads or standard timetables. They responded to sudden tactical demands: forward operating posts under fire, isolated platoons running out of fuel, missions where timing meant survival. Assignments to Task Force Kilo didn't go to just anyone, especially not lieutenants. But the memo was clear. Her name had been submitted by the Regional Logistics Commander after a personal recommendation from Major General Benjamin Pierce, not as a favor, but based on performance metrics and conduct evaluations gathered independently. Natalie's first instinct was doubt. Why now? Why her? But as she scrolled through the attached after-action reports, convoy timelines, and gap assessments, something clicked. Kilo didn't need flashy leaders. They needed someone exact, someone who could operate under pressure without losing composure, someone who didn't flinch when everything else went sideways. She could do that. She had done that. Lieutenant Colonel Harlan brought it up that afternoon during a meeting. "They asked if you're available for a 60-day TDY, he said. "You'd be assigned as acting convoy operations lead. It's temporary, but it's not a small deal." Natalie looked at him, cautious. "Is this about the Calloway situation?" Harlan shook his head firmly. "No. That incident might have brought attention to your name, but your work earned the rest. Logistics performance metrics. You've led the most efficient convoy scheduling in the brigade. 0 resupply delays in 4 months. That's what got you on their radar." She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She just nodded. "I'll accept." Her first day with Task Force Kilo started before sunrise. The team was based at a satellite outpost with minimal infrastructure, no concrete pads, no offices, no chow hall, just tents, trucks, and dust. Lots of it. Natalie stepped off the transport with a single duffel and her laptop, met by a senior NCO named Master Sergeant Grant. He didn't offer a handshake, just a short nod and a muttered, "Ma'am." They were watching her. She knew it instantly, not out of malice, but caution. She was young. She was new. And Kilo had seen their share of officers come and go, some impressive, others liabilities. They weren't going to give trust just because she had a badge and clipboard, which suited her just fine. She spent the first 72 hours without rest, walking the yard, inventorying stock manually, learning every route code and call sign by memory. She didn't bark orders, she asked sharp questions, she adjusted loadout schedules with math and experience. She rerouted a stalled convoy in the middle of a radio blackout using hand-sketched maps and local unit intel. By day 4, Master Sergeant Grant stopped calling her ma'am and started calling her boss. By week 2, the team requested to keep her beyond the original 60-day assignment. One night, as she sat beside a dim lantern sketching out fuel consumption projections, Sergeant Grant dropped a cup of instant coffee beside her. "You know," he said quietly, "we've had captains come through here who couldn't do what you just pulled off in Sector Echo. You don't talk much, but the way you move pieces, it's like watching someone solve a puzzle blindfolded." Natalie glanced up. "Thanks, Sergeant." He started to walk away, then paused. "Word is, your dad's the 1-star who lit up Merrick a few weeks back." She didn't reply. He looked over his shoulder. "Doesn't matter. You didn't ride in on his name. You walked in with your own." Her time with Task Force Kilo extended beyond 60 days. Eventually, the temporary assignment became semi-permanent. She was awarded the Army Commendation Medal for her leadership during an emergency convoy that supplied a forward post under enemy threat with 0 losses. But for Natalie, the real victory wasn't the award. It was the quiet trust she'd built with a hardened team, the respect she'd earned through competence, not rank, the knowledge that she could step into a role most thought was beyond her and thrive not because of who her father was, but because of who she had chosen to be. When the reassignment order came, calling her back to her original unit, Master Sergeant Grant walked her to the landing zone and handed her a folded piece of paper. Inside was a hand-drawn convoy schematic. It had a single note at the bottom. "You don't need a last name. You're already a leader." She tucked it into her pocket as the blades of the Black Hawk kicked up dust around her. And for the first time in months, she allowed herself a small, quiet smile. When Lieutenant Natalie Pierce returned to Camp Merrick, she wasn't the same officer who had left. Word of her performance with Task Force Kilo had already arrived before she did. Officers who used to overlook her now nodded with acknowledgement. Some tried to engage her more than before, masking their past indifference with forced friendliness. She didn't entertain it. She wasn't back for praise. She was back for her people. Her unit had changed in subtle ways during her absence. Procedures had slipped, morale had dipped, a few key mechanics had rotated out, and one of the junior lieutenants had taken over convoy coordination with mixed results. Natalie didn't criticize, she observed. She listened. Then she went to work rebuilding. But not everyone welcomed her return. Lieutenant Adam Voss, the officer who had temporarily filled her position, felt pushed aside. He didn't hide his frustration during team briefings, interrupting her with passive-aggressive remarks and questioning her decisions with thinly veiled sarcasm. "Guess we're back to the Natalie Pierce show," he muttered once, just loud enough for the room to hear. Natalie didn't react, but the team did. Master Sergeant Landers, one of the senior NCOs who had watched her navigate the aftermath of the Callaway incident, shot Voss a glare. "We don't have room for drama, sir, especially not when people are depending on us to do our damn jobs." The tension simmered. And then came the alert. A small forward patrol outpost, barely on the grid, had suffered a vehicle breakdown during a return from patrol. They were low on water, comms were unstable, and temperatures were forecasted to spike dangerously within the next 18 hours. Evac support was delayed due to a larger operation elsewhere. Logistics was the only answer. Natalie reviewed the coordinates en route within seconds. Remote terrain, hostile adjacent zone, no paved access. But she didn't hesitate. "We'll take the backup Humvees with extra jerry cans and water packs," she said. "We'll move overnight to avoid thermal exposure." Voss folded his arms. "You're seriously planning to run an emergency resupply through open desert with vehicles that barely passed inspection last week?" "They'll hold," she replied, scanning the convoy manifest, "and if they don't, I'll walk the last mile if I have to." There was a pause. Then Sergeant Landers muttered, "She's done it before." Natalie didn't wait for permission. She coordinated her team, adjusted radio frequencies manually, double-checked every strap and bolt herself. At Oro 200, they rolled out 3 Humvees, 6 soldiers, and one objective: get supplies to the stranded patrol before heatstroke, or worse, set in. By dawn, they were halfway there when the lead vehicle's suspension snapped on a rocky incline. Voss, who had insisted on coming to monitor, turned pale. "We need to turn back." Natalie shook her head. "We offload half the gear, distribute by weight, we keep moving." They did. 5 hours later, dehydrated and coated in dust, they reached the stranded patrol, 5 exhausted soldiers sitting beneath makeshift shade, faces drawn, lips cracked. One of them had already collapsed. The med kits and water Natalie's team brought may have saved lives that morning. While the medics treated the patrol, Natalie knelt beside the youngest soldier in the group, a private barely out of training. He looked at her and croaked, "Didn't think anyone was coming." She handed him water and replied softly, "We don't leave people behind. Not on my watch." The return trip was slower, but the silence in the Humvees wasn't fear anymore. It was respect. Even Voss, who had remained unusually quiet since the vehicle failure, finally broke the silence. "I was wrong," he said. Natalie didn't look at him. This was never about being right. It's about being responsible. Back at Merrick, the story spread faster than expected. Not because Natalie told it, but because soldiers who had been there told it, and those who hadn't wished they had been. That single rescue run reshaped her image entirely. She wasn't just the daughter of a general. She wasn't just the officer who kept calm after being humiliated. She was the one who showed up when others hesitated, who treated leadership like duty, not status. That week, she received a formal invitation to speak at the Brigade Leader Development Forum, a platform typically reserved for captains and above. She declined. Instead, she asked to spend that time with the mechanics who kept the convoys running, offering to teach a class on supply chain improvisation under duress. "I'd rather help people do it better," she said, "not just talk about what I did." And that was Natalie Pierce's way. She didn't take revenge. She didn't chase praise. She earned every ounce of respect through sweat, silence, and doing the damn job when it counted. 6 months later, Camp Merrick felt like a different place. The air still hung heavy with dust and the dull thrum of generators, but something else had shifted. Something deeper. Soldiers stood a little straighter. Procedures ran smoother. And in the center of it all was a young logistics officer who never raised her voice, never sought credit, but whose influence was now impossible to ignore. Lieutenant Natalie Pierce had become a name whispered with quiet respect across mess tents, motor pools, and planning rooms alike. She had never asked for recognition, never chased a title, but her actions every late-night manifest, Every calm decision under pressure, every convoy that made it through because she refused to cut corners had built something stronger than rank. They had built trust. One evening, just before her scheduled rotation out of the region, she stood alone on the perimeter wall as the sun dipped low, painting the desert in a dusty gold. Behind her, soldiers prepared for another night. Ahead, the horizon stretched wide, open, endless. She exhaled slowly. It was almost over. A soft crunch of boots on gravel interrupted the silence. She turned to see General Benjamin Pierce, out of uniform for once, wearing a simple field jacket and a rare, easy expression. "I heard you're rotating out next week," he said. She nodded. New unit, new base, same grind. He looked out toward the horizon beside her. "I've spent 30 years in this uniform," he said quietly. "I've seen good leaders, and I've seen those who wear the rank without ever earning it." Natalie didn't respond. "I've also seen what happens when people confuse silence for weakness," he added. Then he looked at her. "But you let your work do the talking." She shifted slightly. "Wasn't always easy." He smiled faintly. "That's how you know it mattered." There was a pause. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and handed her a small, worn patch, a subdued version of the logistics branch insignia, the thread barely holding in some places. "This belonged to your grandfather," he said. "Carried it through Korea. He passed it to me when I commissioned, told me, 'Don't ever forget that the people behind the lines keep the ones in front alive.'" She looked down at the patch, fingers brushing the frayed edges. "I think he would have been proud of you," he added, "not because of your name, but because you never needed it." She swallowed hard, nodding once, her throat tight. When he left, she remained there for a long time, the wind tugging at the edges of her uniform, the weight of the patch still resting in her palm. Her last morning at Camp Merrick, the motor pool was unusually quiet. She made one final round-checked inventory, signed off a maintenance schedule, and shook the hands of the NCOs who had worked beside her through heat waves, breakdowns, and mid-mission reroutes. As she approached the exit gate, she noticed something odd: rows of soldiers standing at attention along the main road. They weren't ordered to. No formation had been called, and yet they were there. Mechanics, convoy drivers, supply clerks, even infantry from sister units. Some saluted, others nodded. But all stood in silent tribute as she passed by. Natalie didn't break stride. She didn't wave, didn't cry. But her jaw clenched just once, and her grip on the patch in her hand tightened. Because this was it. The moment she realized something bigger than revenge, bigger than validation, had taken root. She hadn't just survived. She had led. Years later, after she'd left the Army and transitioned into crisis logistics for disaster relief missions, her name came up in a military podcast. A former sergeant from Camp Merrick was recounting a story. "She never raised her voice," he said. "Didn't need to. You just wanted to live up to the standard she carried with her, like the uniform was sacred again." When asked why she left the Army, he answered simply, "She didn't leave it. She just took what she learned and carried it forward to people who needed it most." Natalie Pierce never became famous. She never went viral. She never gave speeches. She never even told her own story. But others did. Because in a world full of noise, she chose clarity. In a system full of shortcuts, she chose consistency. And in a moment where she could have demanded justice, she chose discipline. That's what made her unforgettable. Not because she was the general's daughter, but because she never needed to be. Leadership isn't about rank, volume, or vengeance. It's about showing up, even when no one's watching. It's about holding the line when it would be easier to let go. Natalie Pierce's story reminds us that true strength lies not in retaliation, but in restraint. In a world that often celebrates the loudest voice in the room, she chose quiet integrity. She didn't fight disrespect with anger. She responded with excellence, and in doing so, she transformed the moment of humiliation into a legacy of honor. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe and turn on the bell. Share it with someone who needs a quiet reminder of what real strength looks like. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.